Hi, everybody. This is David Nevins for Citybiz List, and thank you so much for joining us today. And today we continue with another of our special discussions sponsored by the Bridge Alliance, which we call Repairing America's Broken Democracy. And toward that end, we have with us Miles Taylor. He is a New York Times best-selling author about to come out with a new book. Miles, thank you so much for joining us.
David, thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
Wonderful to host you, Miles. So if anybody's actually wondering about the name of your book, it's over your left shoulder, and it's called Blowback. And so, Miles, why don't you just begin and tell us a little bit about the new book, and give us a little bit of information also on how this arrived. And I know this is not your first book, so I'm going to let you kind of run freely and share some information with our audience.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, look, David, this book began in a very unexpected place, and I'll be unusually frank with you about where it started. I conceived of this book on election night 2020 under armed guard in a safe house in Northern Virginia by myself. Why was I in that circumstance? Several months prior, I'd come out publicly to campaign against Donald Trump. I'd served in his administration as his chief of staff at the Department of Homeland Security, thinking that we could keep the administration stable from within. I grew pretty alarmed by very specific episodes of presidential misconduct that I witnessed, sounded the alarm anonymously with a piece in the New York Times, then later unmasked myself. What I didn't expect was the level of crowdsourced vitriol that would follow that revelation. So much so that my friends, my family were receiving death threats. They were having their information doxxed. I was forced out of my home and my job and into protective custody. Now, I always say no one has to have sympathy for me. I went into this situation eyes wide open to blow the whistle on Donald Trump and campaign against him. What was jarring to me, though, was that I was seeing so many other people experience the same thing, which said to me that this was more than just about Donald Trump, that there were some underlying issues within our democracy when it came to political intimidation and violence. And it sent me on an odyssey to dig into that. And one of the things I've done over the course of the past 2 years is try to interview experts on political violence, but also talk to people from within the Trump administration, my former colleagues, and ask them what would have happened in a second term and what would happen if someone like him comes back to the White House. You don't have to believe me, but I wanted to use their words to paint a picture of how that might affect civil discourse in this country. And I'll just say, David, I was even shocked by what folks told me.
So, Miles, it certainly is not out of the realm of possibility that Donald Trump returns to the White House. He's actively campaigning, as you know, and the polls are such that, let's just say, stranger things have happened, right? So tell us a little bit about what some of your sources said and why that is potentially a danger to our country.
Well, there were a number of things that people I talked to that had served in the Trump administration were worried about if either Donald Trump was reelected or a similar populist figure retook the White House. One comment from John Bolton, who'd been Donald Trump's national security advisor, was he was very worried that a second Trump administration would be staffed by fifth raters. In other words, that there wouldn't be people who were qualified to serve in these top jobs in the national security community and other important departments and agencies, which could put America in a difficult situation in a crisis, having young, inexperienced political operatives running really important agencies rather than experienced public servants. Mark Esper, who had been defense secretary under Donald Trump, pointed to a really specific worry in his former department, the Department of Defense, and said he worried in the second term that Donald Trump would pull U.S. forces back from key places overseas, places where they're forward deployed to protect American interests, to counter entities like China, the Kremlin, and to prevent terrorist attacks. And his concern is that America would be more vulnerable if those types of actions were taken in a second term. And it's clear those types of actions were on the table. So, as I noted, this isn't meant to be a polemic against the Republican Party. I was a lifelong Republican. I'm a conservative. The concern is more having individuals who have a populist, more extremist view serving in the White House, pulling on the levers of American power for political purposes. And those comments from former officials also applied to the legislative branch and the judicial branch. There was a lot of concern from Republican members of Congress about what Congress might be asked to do in a second term, and also people who'd served in Trump's Department of Justice, worried about the FBI being gutted in a second term and worried about special counsels being used to go after political rivals. These are the types of things that can cause damage to democracy's guardrails. And so I try to lay them out in very specific detail to help folks understand what elements of the MAGA movement were planning if they retook the White House, so people can be aware of that in 2024 and beyond.
Miles, you alluded to, and we've seen bits and pieces of it, and you certainly alluded to the fact that even you and your family experienced this a little bit. But political violence is relatively new to us in this country, certainly in modern times. We've had a civil war and what have you, but and other countries have political violence, all the time. How did we get here, and how do we potentially get out of it? Back to what we might call the good old days of normal political discourse and so forth.
Well, I think, David, the easy thing you can put your finger on is hyperpolarization in our political system. And that polarization has led to a phenomenon that I saw a lot when I was working in counterterrorism. Most of my career has been in national security, and most of that spent looking at foreign terrorist groups overseas. And one of the things you see throughout history when a movement jumps the track from rhetoric to violence is first you have a population that feels very disaffected, feels like they don't have control over their political system. And we've seen in recent decades, according to Pew surveys and other big think tanks, that Americans increasingly don't feel like they have control over their political system because it's so partisan, and it means the extremes, especially in the primary process, that 10% of extreme ideologues in our country are kind of making the decisions for the rest of us, the 90% of us. That disaffection leads people to go down the rabbit hole and explore ways around the system. And often what you see historically is the emergence of conspiracy theories, and then conspiracy theories leading to violence. Things like what we're seeing with QAnon in the United States, the notion that the American government is secretly controlled by a cabal of individuals, the sort of deep state government, if you will. That sort of conspiracy theory leads people to justify engaging in acts of violence, because if they believe they can't affect change through the system, they'll find other ways to affect change. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. If you go and look at the data, University of Chicago did a really big study on this last year, and they found out, shockingly, that something like 1 in 10 Americans now believed that the use of force was justified to restore Donald Trump to the White House. Because in their mind, as they said as respondents to the poll, Trump had unfairly had the presidency stolen from him. And in their view, the only way to give it back was to use weapons to go restore him to the White House. That number compares to another survey that came out that NPR did that found out that roughly 25% of Americans actually have a favorable attitude today of violence towards the government. Those are shocking figures, higher than we've ever seen in the modern era. And then if I put my national security hat back on, as I was leaving government, we were seeing the largest spike in chatter about threats to public officials at any point since the 9/11 attacks or any period prior. And those were largely threats from domestic actors and not foreign terrorist groups. So we're seeing a surge. And as you note, David, political intimidation and violence in this country. And I think in the long run, the only way to turn down the temperature is to start looking at structural democracy reform to make sure that people don't feel alienated from the system.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what that means, and in terms of what kind of reforms you're suggesting. And I guess I see, do you find it at all ironic that here you are, this career long, as you said, national security expert, lifelong Republican until I guess recently, lifelong conservative, and now here you are, talking about how, writing the book Blowback and really critiquing, I guess, a lot of the infrastructure and the folks that you've served with for so many years.
Yeah, I mean, look, I will say from a personal standpoint, it's been one of the most disappointing things I've ever experienced in my life. When you come up in American politics, you are in a tribe. And after 9/11, I'd become a Republican, and I'd served in the George W. Bush administration. I worked in Dick Cheney's office. I worked in the Pentagon on Capitol Hill. I envisioned an entire career in the Republican Party. Defecting from my party is like a wrecking ball to my career. And I didn't go into that lightly. But my bigger concern is that people would avoid telling the truth about what they're witnessing because of that fear, because of the fear of career repercussions or other things. And I've seen that a lot, unfortunately. I've seen a lot of folks in Washington have grave concerns about the behavior and conduct they're witnessing from public officials, but not speak out because of that. And this is going to sound deeply ironic coming from me, David, but I do believe, and I write about this in the book, I believe the greatest threat to our democracy today is anonymity. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the collective decision of folks to not speak up about wrongdoing that they witnessed. Now, personally, I regret that I didn't come forward sooner and unmask myself as this anonymous critique of the Trump administration, because what I realized after the fact, that the reason more people weren't coming forward is that they were scared and there wasn't someone to give them air cover. And once I came forward, I noticed a lot of my colleagues were more willing to do it and speak about things they'd witnessed, speak about misconduct inside the government. And I'm still seeing that within our political system is people who know better, people who will tell you things in private, senators, congressmen, former cabinet secretaries, that they're not willing to say in public. And in psychology, this is something called the bystander phenomenon. We read about it in the news all the time. Someone on a New York City subway gets beaten up, and it's a crowded subway. No one steps in to do anything. Why? Because there's this assumption that someone else will do it first. But if someone doesn't do it first, then other people won't join in. I do think this is a big threat to our democracy, and it goes to this issue of cancel culture we're seeing. People are very afraid to speak their minds because they're worried about the repercussions. Really, the only way to counteract that is folks breaking the seal, if you will, and coming forward to, again, lower that cost for other people. Now, one of the ways you mentioned democracy reforms, one of the ways that we can do that in mass is to make it easier for moderates and sensible candidates across the political spectrum to compete for public office. And democracy scholars, have proposed a number of different things like ranked choice voting, like open primaries. There's a number of reforms that can be undertaken to make the political process more competitive so that the extremes on both sides don't dominate that process. Now, those are the types of reforms that take decades to put in place. We've seen some states do it, but this is a long haul solution to get over political intimidation and violence.
Right. And, I would add to that list, term limits and the elimination of gerrymandering. And if we can accomplish some of these things, it does seem that, and I was curious in your book, the extent to which people are quoted and are identified, because it's so frustrating to me, and it doesn't really matter Republican or Democrat, that while one is in Congress, either party, while one is a cabinet member to a president, either party, it's really not until they leave office, of course, that they maybe sometimes, reluctantly begin to talk about how things really were. And of course, that's about job preservation, right? They're just not yet ready to be fired by the president, or they're not yet ready. They want to get their years in Congress. But all these things ultimately hurt because, as you mentioned, anonymity doesn't have the strength to fix things to the extent that people who identify themselves do.
And I'll add to that, David. I have no judgment of people who would blow the whistle and try to protect their families. You know, the intelligence community whistleblower who brought forward charges that Donald Trump said inappropriate things on a phone call with the Ukrainian president. That individual still remains anonymous and is protected under whistleblower protection laws. I pass no judgment. I think that sometimes you're in a situation where you need to choose that route to protect your life and family. But I do think politically it is more powerful when folks are out there in their own name, especially in this moment that we're in. And you asked, in the book, if folks were willing to go on the record. I would say the slight majority of people I talked to were, but it was really dispiriting to have folks that are still in senior roles within the Republican Party, in Congress, elsewhere, ask me if I would preserve their anonymity in the book, and didn't want to use their names. Those are folks who I've respected those wishes, but a number of them I've gone back to in advance of publication and said, I'd really encourage you to say the things you said to me on background on the record. It will
Right.
make a difference. And I think we've got to, some of their colleagues will be quoted by name in this book and hopefully make it easier for them to come forward and own their words.
So Miles, just we're just about out of time, and this has been very interesting. But give us a tidbit from the new book, Blowback. Share with us one of the more interesting quips that we will soon have the opportunity to read.
Well, David, I'll give you a funny one just because everything seems so dark and dreary in our politics. There are few people, I think, on this planet that have spent more time trying to make sure that their former boss doesn't succeed. And in my case, I've tried to make sure that Donald Trump doesn't return to public office. But I'll be the first to admit there are times in private where the man was even charming. And, that's widely known. That's a shared anecdote. And there was a funny moment where we were in the Oval Office in 2018 preparing the president for the landfall of a major Category 5 hurricane. And it was one of the few briefings with the president where I found him to actually be paying attention, very focused on the briefing about the threat that was about to hit the United States. And then he interrupted the flow of the briefing and he said, this is amazing. Do they, he looked at the hurricane graphic. He said, do they always spin that way? And I said, Mr. President, I'm not sure what you mean. He says, the hurricanes, they always spin that way. And I said, counterclockwise? Yeah. And I said, yes, Mr. President, it's called the Coriolis effect. It's the same reason toilet water spins the opposite direction in Australia. And his response was, incredible, incredible. All of them spin that direction. And that was a moment of a little bit of concern because he was a little bit more focused on how the hurricanes spin than the fact that they were going to make landfall in the United States and potentially threaten millions of Americans. But there were silly moments like that you had with Donald Trump where, you hoped he'd rise to the moment and maybe didn't. But here's the thing. I think for our country, putting politics aside, we want experienced people to be in the Oval Office, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, and not people who are having to learn on the job in real time as American lives are under threat. And in far more serious circumstances, I saw that during the Trump administration, moments that should have been sober moments that were instead moments of levity or sort of disregard. And that's what we need to be cognizant of voters as we go in, is taking good care of our institutions and reinforcing democracy's guardrails.
Well, thank you so much, Miles Taylor, for joining us. And your new book is called Blowback, and that will be out in mid-July. And good luck. And we will talk again sometime soon.
All right. Thank you, friends.
This is David Nevins for Citybiz List, and another of our conversations with the Bridge Alliance, which we entitle Repairing America's Broken Democracy. Thank you so much for joining us today.